Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Spoken Word. My name is Travis. I'm your host, and today we're going to be finishing up this discussion of all things dark and occultic. And we're going to be talking about the connection between interaction with these dark powers and the development of occult practices and powers in some of those cases. So let's look at a passage from Deuteronomy 12, and this is from verses 29 through 32. And Moses is having a conversation with the people of Israel and tells them, basically, don't even inquire about the gods of the Canaanites. He says, when the Lord your God annihilates the nations before you, which you are entering to take possession of, and you drive them out and live in their land, be careful not to be ensnared by their ways after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire about their gods, asking, how do these nations worship their gods? I'll do the same. You must not do the same to the Lord your God, because they practice every detestable act which the Lord hates for their gods. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Be careful to do everything I command you. Do not add anything to it or take anything away from it. So in this passage, there's a connection between these, quote, detestable acts that are performed for these gods of Canaan. So what were those detestable acts? Well, in Deuteronomy 18, 9 through 14, Moses gives us a bit of an answer. He says, when you enter the land the Lord your God has given you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. No one among you is to sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery, cast spells, consult a medium or a spiritist, or inquire of the dead. Everyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and the Lord your God is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable acts. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. Though these nations you are about to drive out listen to fortune tellers and diviners, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do this. So, in my culture, people are probably most familiar with people casting spells and sorcery and whatever else kind of stuff is, I don't know, from a Disney movie. We don't think of these things as being real, but the Old Testament suggests that there is reality behind the fiction that we may have in our modern world. So much so that I can say with certainty from the scriptures that there are real versions of these abilities. There are times when they have been real. Take a look at the sorcerers of Egypt. If you look in Exodus 7 and 8, there are multiple mentions of the Egyptian magicians replicating what Moses and Aaron did by God's power, except these guys were doing it, quote, by their occult practices. So it's saying that their results may have been the same, but their power sources were different. And these guys were able to change staves into snakes, water into blood, and draw frogs out of the Nile. So that's some pretty weird stuff. And it's not mentioned where their power came from exactly. But I think that we're supposed to assume that just as Moses and Aaron were empowered by something external, that these guys were also empowered by something greater than or outside of themselves. And it's just left silent as to who or what that was. There's another story that comes from the book of 1 Samuel that's really curious. This is chapter 28, verses 3 through 19, where there's a king named Saul, and he is trying to get some advice from a prophet named Samuel, except the only problem is that Samuel is dead by this point. So what does Saul do? He goes and finds a spiritist to talk to and tries to get her to commune with Samuel from beyond the grave. Well, the shocking thing is that this actually happens. Saul does talk to Samuel, and it's kind of left up in the air as to what exactly happened here. It gives no description in this passage of what exactly this woman did, but we are left to assume that her act of divination or whatever she was doing had some kind of real effect, because Samuel says, why do you disturb me? So it's not like he said, oh, you guys thought that you were doing divination, but haha, God has the upper hand on you, and here I am appearing at his behest. It doesn't say that. It's left to make us assume that this woman actually did something real here. So we have communion with dead people that's happening inside the Bible here. I'm sure that there are other examples besides just these, but here's another couple of passages that are pretty explicit. And this is from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 2, verse 8, and from chapter 23, verse 13, for those of you keeping score. And in both passages, it makes a claim that prophets who were living at the time of Jeremiah prophesied by Baal. Baal is one of these Old Testament gods that we meet, and Jeremiah says that there were prophets that were empowered by him. So not only does that validate our earlier assertion that, yeah, some of these entities were real, but it also validates this notion that not only were they real, but they had some kind of power that they could even delegate to people. So just as Jeremiah was a prophet who would prophesy by Yahweh, these guys were prophesying by Baal. We see things like this even in the New Testament. We see like people having really, really weird abilities that are certainly unnatural. Like if you read in Mark 5, 1 through 15, there's a guy who is almost like an anti-Samson. Samson was a guy in the Old Testament who was given supernatural strength by God. But in this passage, we meet a guy who, kind of like Samson, was really strong, but he was possessed by an unclean spirit, a demon. It says that no one was able to restrain him, not even with a chain, because he often had been bound with shackles and chains, but had torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. We know that this guy wasn't just a really good bodybuilder, and he wasn't schizophrenic or something like that, because Jesus himself interacts with the demons that are possessing this guy, and he casts them out. You can't do that with psychosis. You can't do that with something that's not an entity. So again, we see these miraculous powers coming from a really dark source. We meet a young girl in Acts chapter 16, verses 16 through 18, where there is a young slave girl who has a spirit by which she predicted the future. And again, this isn't just someone who was really clever at, reading economics or something, making good future predictions. Paul, who was one of the great apostles of the New Testament, one of the great missionaries of the church, he actually cast the spirit out of her. You can't do that if this is just somebody being really, really good at the shell game. So we have cases like this, and I'm certainly there are many, many others that you could quote throughout both the Old and the New Testament. But what I want you to understand here is that paganism is not and never has been make-believe. There is reality to it. There are real spiritual entities that can be worshipped. There are real powers that they give people. And we completely defang all of these passages that I just read and many, many more if we deny this. So where does that leave us? It means that there are dark spiritual forces that are real, and they are opposed to Yahweh and are opposed to his people. And what does that mean? Well, just because in ancient times, they are a power that influences people outside of the covenant community. Just like Baal and Ashtoreth and Molech oppressed the Canaanites, so now such forces oppress your neighbor and my neighbor in some way, whether or not they know it. And even worse, at least here in my country, the United States, it is becoming far, far more common for people to reach out into the dark, to dabble in things that other generations would have called the occult. And these passages stand as a warning to me and say that when people reach into the dark, we should not be shocked if the dark reaches back. And we should also not be shocked if we ourselves witness things that are hard to explain, but are not from a good origin. So this is a moment whenever I think it's really valuable for us to sit with this realization and sit with the knowledge that we are engaged in a spiritual conflict rather than just pulling out the, well, Jesus trumps everything card. Yes, it's true that Jesus trumps everything eternally, and it is certainly true for believers that he who is in us is greater than he who is in the world. But let's not forget that that's not true for our neighbor who is not indwelt by the Spirit. They are open to influence by these things, and we should be aware of that. So that's all I have to say on this topic for now. I hope that this maybe just whets your appetite a little bit, encourages you to think about some things on your own. But that's all well and good now that we've kind of formed up the cosmic conflict that we're seeing here, even developing in the Old Testament. But since we're still sitting at the story of the Exodus, do we have any reason to think that these events actually happened? Do we even have a reason to think that, I don't know, all the plagues happened or that there were pharaohs living in this time or place or what have you? So we're going to turn our attention in the next couple of episodes to look at some archaeology that's really fascinating and I think validates many, many portions of these stories. So I hope that you all will enjoy that. I certainly will. But for now, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your time. And with that, God bless, and I will see you in the next episode.